What starts as a routine trip to the bank for Martha Johnson quickly spirals into a humiliating experience when she's treated with suspicion over a simple check. Her son, Marcus, steps in to defend her, but this personal battle soon becomes a fight for justice against a powerful institution. As they take their stand in court, will they uncover a hidden pattern of discrimination, and will they win? Before we dive in, subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories of resilience and justice. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think might happen next. Now let's get into the story. The early morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains in the modest living room of Martha Johnson's home. It was a house filled with memories, a two-story clapboard house in a quiet neighborhood that had seen generations pass through its doors. It was here that Martha had raised her two children, and now she spent her days doting on her grandson, Jason. The house was old, but it was home. The creaks in the floorboards as she shuffled across the room were familiar, comforting even. At 73, Martha was still sharp, though her body had begun to betray her with age. Her knees ached when she stood for too long, and she relied on a cane for support when her balance wavered. But she never complained. Life had taught her the value of patience, and Martha had always been strong. Not physically, perhaps, but in every other way that mattered. As she slowly lowered herself into her favorite armchair near the window, she glanced around the room. The walls were adorned with pictures of family, her late husband, George, her children, Marcus and Evelyn, and of course, Jason. Her heart swelled with pride every time she looked at those photos, each one a testament to the family she had built through years of hard work and sacrifice. Martha leaned over to the side table and picked up a small silver frame. It was a picture of Jason in his high school graduation gown, a bright smile lighting up his young face. He was standing next to her and Marcus, both of them beaming with pride. She smiled as she ran her fingers over the glass, her mind drifting back to that day just a few months ago. It had been one of the proudest moments of her life. Jason had always been a bright boy, curious, thoughtful, and hardworking. From a young age, he had shown a love for learning, and Martha had done everything she could to nurture that in him. She had made sure he had books to read, helped him with his schoolwork, and supported him in every way she could. And now all that hard work was paying off. Jason had been accepted to Harvard University, a dream that Martha and Marcus had scarcely allowed themselves to hope for. But Jason had done it. He had made it. And now, as she sat in the quiet of her living room, Martha felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The sacrifices she and George had made over the years, the long hours of work, the penny pinching, the careful budgeting, had all been worth it. Jason's future was bright, and she was determined to help him in any way she could. Her gaze shifted to the small desk in the corner of the room where an envelope sat unopened. Inside was the check that represented a lifetime of savings. It was money from the recent sale of a property she and George had owned for decades, a modest plot of land that had been in the family for generations. Martha had finally made the difficult decision to sell it, knowing that the money would go a long way in helping Jason with his tuition and expenses at Harvard. She sighed softly, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. The land had been a part of her life for so long, but in the end, it was just land. What mattered most was Jason's future, and she would gladly give up anything to ensure that he had the opportunities she had never been given. Martha slowly rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and careful. She reached for her cane, gripping it tightly as she made her way to the desk. The envelope lay there, the check inside representing years of patience, sacrifice, and love. It was a large sum, more than Martha had ever seen in one place at one time, and she knew that cashing it was the next step in helping Jason. Today was the day. The ride to the bank was quiet. Martha sat in the back seat of the taxi, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her purse resting on her knees. She glanced out the window as the familiar streets of the city passed by, the old brick buildings, the corner store where she used to buy groceries, the park where she had once taken Marcus and Evelyn to play when they were children. Everything seemed so familiar, yet today felt different. There was a sense of importance in the air, as though this trip to the bank carried more weight than any other. The taxi driver, a young man in his 20s, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Here we are, ma'am," he said, pulling up to the curb in front of First Freedom Bank, the city's largest and most prestigious financial institution. Martha smiled politely, her heart fluttering with a mix of anticipation and nerves. "Thank you, young man," she replied warmly, reaching into her purse for the fare. As she handed him the bills, she felt the familiar ache in her fingers, a reminder of the years of work that had taken their toll on her body. The driver smiled back and wished her a good day as she carefully stepped out of the taxi, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement. Martha stood for a moment, looking up at the grand facade of the bank. Its towering columns and gleaming glass windows reflected the bustling city around it. And for a moment, Martha felt a pang of discomfort. She had been a customer of this bank for over 30 years, but standing here today, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. She straightened her shoulders, adjusting the shawl around her as she made her way toward the entrance. The automatic doors whooshed open as she approached, and the cool air inside the bank washed over her, a stark contrast to the warmth of the afternoon sun. Inside, the bank was as grand as ever. The marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting of the chandeliers, and the walls were lined with sleek modern furniture. It was a place of wealth and power, a place where people came to manage their fortunes. Yet, despite its elegance, there was a coldness in the air that Martha hadn't noticed before. She made her way to the main counter, her cane tapping softly against the marble floor with each step. The bank was busy, as it usually was on a weekday afternoon. Customers stood in line, tellers moved efficiently behind the counters, and the faint murmur of conversations filled the space. But there was something different today. Something Martha couldn't quite put her finger on. As she approached the counter, she noticed that the usual warm smiles and polite greetings from the staff were absent. The tellers were focused on their work, barely glancing up at the customers they served. The air felt tense, and Martha couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though no one seemed to acknowledge her presence. She reached the front of the line, and a young man sitting behind the counter looked up from his computer screen. His name tag read Tom Davis, and his crisp white shirt and neatly knotted tie suggested that he took his job seriously. But there was no warmth in his expression, no sign of the friendly professionalism Martha had come to expect from the bank's staff. "Good afternoon," Martha said with a polite smile, placing her handbag on the counter. "I'd like to cash this check, please." Tom glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to his computer. "Your account number," he asked, his tone flat and uninterested. Martha reached into her purse and pulled out the check, sliding it across the counter toward him. "I believe this check should be sufficient," she said. "It's from the sale of a property I owned. I'd like to cash it today." Tom's fingers froze on the keyboard for a moment as his eyes flicked down to the check. He stared at the piece of paper for a long time, his expression shifting from mild disinterest to something more unsettling: confusion, disbelief, and finally, suspicion. "This is a large amount," he muttered, lifting the check with the tips of his fingers as though it might stain his hands. His tone carried an undercurrent of accusation, and Martha felt her stomach tighten. "I'm aware," she replied calmly, refusing to let his attitude rattle her. "I've been a customer here for many years. There shouldn't be any problem with this transaction." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced back at the computer screen, his fingers tapping the keyboard in quick, nervous bursts. "Where exactly did you come by this kind of money?" he asked, his voice laced with condescension. Martha felt a chill run down her spine. She had encountered this kind of attitude before, but not here. Not in the bank where she had always been treated with respect. The tone in Tom's voice, the way he looked at her, as though she didn't belong, as though she were a stranger in a place she had known for decades, it was unsettling, and it stung. "The money is from the sale of a property I've owned for many years," Martha explained, keeping her voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. "Everything is legitimate. Now, if you would kindly process the check, I would appreciate it." But Tom didn't move. He held the check between his fingers, turning it over slowly, his eyes scanning the numbers as though searching for something suspicious. "We have policies," he said slowly, his smirk widening. "We can't just cash large checks like this without some additional verification." Martha felt her pulse quicken. This was not the response she had expected. She had been a loyal customer of this bank for decades, had never once had an issue with her account. And now this young man, who couldn't have been more than half her age, was questioning her integrity. "I've provided everything you need," Martha said, her voice growing firmer. "There is no reason for this to be so complicated. Please process the check." Tom tapped the check against the counter, clearly stalling. His eyes darted to the side, and Martha followed his gaze to where the security guard stood a few feet away. The guard, a burly man with a buzz cut and a stony expression, caught Tom's eye and gave a subtle nod. Martha felt her heart sink as the guard began to approach, his heavy footsteps echoing across the marble floor. This wasn't right. She hadn't done anything wrong. But the way they were treating her, the way they were looking at her, it was as if they had already decided that she didn't belong here. "Is there a problem here?" the security guard asked as he reached the counter, his voice low and authoritative. Martha straightened her posture, gripping the handle of her cane a little tighter. "No, there's no problem," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just trying to cash my check." The guard's eyes flicked to the check in Tom's hand, then back to Martha. "This is a large sum," he said, as if that explained everything. "We need to be cautious with transactions like these." Martha could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. They were treating her like she was some kind of criminal, like she was trying to pull one over on them. But all she wanted was to cash her check and leave. "I've been a customer here for over 30 years, Martha said, her voice growing louder. "I've never had a problem with this bank before. Why is this happening now?" Tom leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, as a smug expression settled on his face. "We have to follow procedures, Mom," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe this isn't the right bank for you." The words hung in the air like a slap to the face. Martha's stomach churned, and for a moment she was at a loss for words. She had been here before, faced with that quiet, insidious kind of discrimination that made her question her own worth. But this time, it was different. This time, it felt personal. "I need to speak with the manager," Martha said, her voice shaking slightly, but she held her ground. "Now." Tom rolled his eyes, but the guard didn't move. He stood there, arms folded, his presence looming over the conversation like a threat. Martha could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, but no one stepped in to help. They all pretended not to notice. Martha stood at the counter, her breath coming in shallow waves. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted from uncomfortable to oppressive. She could feel her pulse quickening in her chest, the embarrassment of the situation gnawing at her. All around her, the murmur of quiet conversations filled the air. And though no one spoke to her directly, she could sense the curious glances from the other customers. It wasn't the first time Martha had been made to feel out of place in her own community. Growing up in the South during the height of segregation, she had learned early on that people like her weren't always welcome in certain spaces. But she had never imagined that such prejudice could follow her into her old age. And certainly not in a place like First Freedom Bank, where she had banked for decades. As Tom and the security guard continued their silent, condescending standoff, Martha's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to be pushed aside, not today. She pulled her cell phone from her purse and, with shaky hands, dialed the one person she knew she could count on: her son, Marcus. The phone rang twice before Marcus answered. "Mom!" His voice was calm, though Martha could hear the edge of concern in his tone. Martha took a deep breath, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Marcus, I'm at the bank. They're refusing to cash my check. They're treating me like I don't belong here." There was a pause on the other end, and Martha could almost feel Marcus' mood shift from concern to anger. "Which branch are you at?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, but now carrying an undercurrent of something more serious. "The downtown branch," Martha replied. "You'll be there in 15 minutes, Marcus said. "Stay where you are and don't let them bully you. I'll handle this." Martha nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Marcus had always been protective of her, ever since he was a boy. He was a lawyer now, a respected one at that. known for his work in civil rights and justice. If anyone could handle this situation, it was Marcus. The glass doors of First Freedom Bank swung open with a quiet hiss as Marcus Johnson strode in. His tall, broad-shouldered frame seemed to command attention from the moment he entered. Dressed in a tailored suit, his expression was one of calm authority, but there was no mistaking the fire simmering beneath the surface. Marcus' gaze immediately found his mother standing near the counter, looking smaller and more fragile than usual. His chest tightened with anger at the sight of her being treated this way, but he forced himself to remain composed. Now wasn't the time to lose his temper. Now was the time to act. Martha's eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and pride when she saw her son. "Marcus," she said softly as he approached, her voice betraying the tension she had been holding in. "Mom?" Marcus replied, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Martha nodded, though Marcus could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "They won't cash the check," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "They're acting like I'm doing something wrong." Marcus turned his gaze toward Tom, who had been watching the interaction from behind the counter. Tom's smug expression faltered as he realized who Marcus was. There was no mistaking it, Marcus Johnson had a reputation, and not just as a lawyer. He was a man who didn't back down, a man who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. Marcus' eyes narrowed as he stepped toward the counter. "I understand there's been a problem with my mother's transaction," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Would you care to explain why that is?" Tom swallowed, his earlier confidence slipping. "It's just, this is a large sum," he stammered. "We need to follow protocols to prevent fraud." "Fraud," Marcus repeated, his tone cold. "My mother has been a customer of this bank for over 30 years. There's no reason to suspect fraud. So, let me ask again, what exactly is the problem here?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the security guard for support. The guard, Frank, stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "Sir, we have policies in place for large transactions," Frank said. "We're just following the rules." Marcus' eyes flicked between Tom and Frank, and he could feel the anger rising in his chest. But he kept his voice level, refusing to let them see how deeply this had affected him. "I want to speak to your manager," Marcus said, his voice firm but steady. "Now." A few minutes later, Carol Stevens, the bank's manager, emerged from her office in the back. A woman in her mid-40s, Carol carried herself with the professionalism of someone who had spent years navigating the corporate world. Her tailored suit and polished demeanor gave the impression of competence. But as she approached the scene unfolding at the front of the bank, there was a flash of nervousness in her eyes. "Good afternoon," Carol said, her voice calm but a little too rehearsed. "I'm the manager here. Is there a problem?" "Yes," Marcus replied, turning to face her. "There's a serious problem. Your staff is refusing to cash my mother's check, despite the fact that she's been a customer of this bank for decades. They've treated her with suspicion and disrespect, and I want to know why." Carol blinked, taken aback by Marcus' directness. She glanced at Martha, then back at Marcus. "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said, her tone carefully measured. "We have policies in place to ensure the safety of our clients and to prevent fraudulent activity. I'm sure you understand." "I understand that my mother has done nothing wrong," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "This isn't about fraud or safety. This is about your staff treating her like she doesn't belong here. And I'm not going to let it slide." Carol's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you, we take all of our customers' concerns seriously," she said, her voice growing more formal. "If you'd like to discuss this further, we can step into my office." "No," Marcus said firmly, cutting her off. "We're going to handle this right here in front of everyone. My mother has nothing to hide, and I want to make sure that whatever policy you claim to be following is applied equally to all your customers. Because if it is, then we have a much bigger problem on our hands." A silence fell over the bank lobby. The tension in the air was thick, and all eyes were on the unfolding confrontation. Marcus stood tall, his expression unwavering, while Carol shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Tom and Frank, who had once seemed so confident, now looked uncertain, their smug attitudes replaced by a growing unease. Carol glanced around the room, realizing that there was no easy way out of this. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the eyes of the customers, the simmering anger in Marcus' voice, and the undeniable fact that the bank was on the verge of a very public scandal. "All right," Carol said finally, her voice tight with forced professionalism. "He'll have the check processed immediately." Marcus didn't move, his gaze still fixed on her. "And I want an apology," he said, his voice cold and firm. "My mother deserves to be treated with respect. She's not leaving here until she gets one." Carol's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Of course," she said, though her voice lacked sincerity. "We apologize for any misunderstanding, Mrs. Johnson. It wasn't our intention to cause you any distress." Martha, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, felt a pang of bitterness at the hollow apology. But she kept her composure, her hands gripping the handle of her cane tightly as she nodded in acknowledgement. The check was finally processed, but the damage had been done. Marcus could see the look of exhaustion and hurt in his mother's eyes, and it only fueled his anger. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the time Marcus and Martha left the bank, the video of the incident had already made its way onto social media. A young woman standing near the front of the line had recorded the entire confrontation on her phone and posted it online with the caption, "Racial profiling at First Freedom Bank. This needs to stop." Within hours, the video had gone viral. Thousands of people shared it, outraged by the way Martha had been treated. The hashtags Justice for Martha and Dignity for All began trending on Twitter, and soon news outlets picked up the story. Reporters reached out to Marcus for comment, and civil rights organizations began calling for accountability from the bank. That evening, Marcus sat in his living room, his phone buzzing constantly with notifications. He had just finished giving an interview to a local news station, and the support for his mother was growing by the minute. The public outcry was fierce, and it was clear that this incident had struck a chord with people across the country. Martha sat beside him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "I didn't expect all this," she said quietly, gesturing to the news reports flashing across the TV screen. "It's overwhelming." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "People are tired of seeing this kind of thing happen, Mom," he said. "They're tired of being treated like second-class citizens because of how they look or how much money they have. This is bigger than just us." Martha sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I just wanted to cash a check," she said softly, her voice heavy with fatigue. "I know," Marcus said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "But now we have to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The next morning, a peaceful protest was organized outside First Freedom Bank. Civil rights leaders, community activists, and everyday citizens gathered with signs and banners, calling for justice for Martha and demanding an end to discriminatory practices in banking. The protest was peaceful but powerful, and news cameras captured every moment. People chanted, "Dignity for all," as they marched in front of the bank's doors, holding signs that read, "End banking discrimination and respect our elders." Marcus stood at the front of the crowd, his mother by his side. He held a microphone in his hand, addressing the crowd with a calm but passionate voice. "This isn't just about my mother," Marcus said, his voice echoing through the streets. "This is about everyone who has ever been treated like they don't belong, who has ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. We deserve respect. We deserve dignity, and we won't stop fighting until we get it." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a surge of energy run through him. This was just the beginning. By the end of the week, First Freedom Bank's legal team had reached out to Marcus. They wanted to settle. The negative publicity had been overwhelming, and the bank's executives were eager to resolve the situation before it escalated any further. But Marcus wasn't interested in a quick settlement. This wasn't just about money. It was about accountability, about making sure that what had happened to his mother wouldn't happen to anyone else. The bank offered a sizable financial settlement and a public apology, but Marcus turned it down. He filed a formal lawsuit against the bank, citing racial and age-based discrimination. The lawsuit quickly gained media attention, and Marcus knew that this was his chance to bring about real change. The bank, however, wasn't going down without a fight. Their legal team pushed back, arguing that the bank had followed standard procedure and that any discomfort Martha had experienced was an unfortunate but necessary part of their anti-fraud measures. But Marcus knew better. He gathered evidence statements from witnesses, videos from customers, and data on discriminatory practices within the banking industry. The more he dug, the more he realized that what had happened to his mother was part of a larger pattern of systemic discrimination. As the legal battle heated up, the public's support for Martha grew stronger. Protests continued outside the bank, and civil rights organizations rallied behind Marcus' case, offering legal resources and amplifying the message of justice and dignity for all. The bank's reputation was in tatters, and Marcus knew that they were on the verge of a major breakthrough. But the fight wasn't over yet. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal filings, press coverage, and public protests. Marcus sat at his desk in his law office, his laptop open in front of him, as he reviewed the lawsuit against First Freedom Bank. The complaint was thorough, citing not just the personal humiliation his mother had faced, but also the broader issue of systemic discrimination within the banking industry. Every hour seemed to bring new developments. The media had latched onto the story, and the public was divided. Some people praised Marcus and his mother for standing up against injustice, while others accused them of exaggerating the incident for personal gain. It was the latter group that angered Marcus the most. How could anyone watch the video of his mother, her dignity, stripped away as the bank's employees treated her like a suspect, and think this was a trivial matter? He leaned back in his chair, his fingers rubbing his temples as the stress of the situation weighed on him. His phone buzzed beside him, and he glanced at the screen. Another message from a civil rights organization offering support. Another interview request from a local news station. The attention was relentless. But despite the mounting pressure, Marcus refused to back down. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. This was about holding an institution accountable for its discriminatory practices. It was about ensuring that no one else, especially the elderly and vulnerable, would ever be treated the way his mother had been treated. Martha, on the other hand, was growing weary. The public attention had been overwhelming for her, and the stress was beginning to take a toll on her health. Marcus visited her every evening after work, bringing her groceries and making sure she had everything she needed. One evening, as they sat together in Martha's small kitchen, she looked at Marcus with a tired but gentle expression. "Marcus, maybe we should settle," she said softly, her hands folded in her lap. "This whole thing has become bigger than I ever wanted it to be. I just wanted to cash a check." Marcus paused, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew how exhausted she was, how much this fight had taken out of her. But he also knew that settling would mean letting the bank off the hook. It would mean allowing them to sweep this under the rug without making any real changes. "Mom," Marcus said quietly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I know this has been hard on you, but we can't stop now. If we settle, they'll never change. They'll keep treating people like they don't matter, and no one will hold them accountable." Martha sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I know you're right," she said. I never thought it would come to this. I don't want to be in the spotlight. I just want things to go back to normal." Marcus nodded, understanding her weariness, but unwilling to let go of the fight. "I promise, Mom. We'll get through this. And when it's over, things will be better. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been treated this way." Meanwhile, inside the headquarters of First Freedom Bank, the atmosphere was tense. In the executive boardroom, a group of senior bank officials and their legal team sat around a long polished table, the weight of the lawsuit pressing down on them like a storm cloud. Carol Stevens, the branch manager who had been at the center of the confrontation, sat at the far end, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't expected this situation to spiral out of control, but now it was a full-blown crisis. Across the table, Daniel Collins, the bank's head of legal affairs, spoke in a clipped tone as he outlined their defense strategy. "We need to be careful here," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "This isn't just about one transaction gone wrong. The public is watching us, and they're framing this as a larger issue of discrimination. If we don't handle this carefully, it could turn into a PR disaster." Carol shifted in her seat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she muttered, almost to herself. "I was just trying to follow protocol." "Protocol doesn't matter now," Daniel snapped. "What matters is how we're going to get out of this without losing more clients and damaging our reputation further." One of the senior executives, Richard Langston, spoke up, his tone calm but authoritative. "What are our options? Can we settle?" Daniel shook his head. "Marcus Johnson isn't interested in settling. We've already made 2 offers, both of which were rejected. He's out for blood." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Then we need to discredit him. If we can't win in court, we need to win in the court of public opinion. Find something in his past, something that makes him look like he's exploiting this for personal gain. We can't afford to let this escalate any further." Daniel nodded, making a note in his legal pad. "I'll see what I can dig up. In the meantime, we need to continue to argue that this was a misunderstanding. Emphasize our policies. Make it clear that we were simply trying to protect the integrity of our banking procedures. If we can frame it as an unfortunate but necessary process, we might be able to sway public opinion back in our favor." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this was a risky move, but they had no other choice. The bank's reputation and its bottom line was on the line. As the weeks went by, the tension surrounding the case continued to build. Public opinion was divided. On social media, the hashtags Justice for Martha and Banking Bias were trending, and civil rights groups were organizing rallies and marches in support of Marcus and his mother. But there was also a growing backlash from those who saw the lawsuit as an overreach, an attempt to turn a minor incident into a national scandal. One afternoon, Marcus sat at his office desk, reviewing the latest filings from the bank's legal team. They were digging into his past, looking for anything they could use to discredit him. He knew they wouldn't find anything. His record was clean, but the constant scrutiny was starting to wear him down. His assistant, Lydia, knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Marcus," she said, stepping into the office with a worried expression, "you might want to take a look at this." She handed him her phone, and Marcus' stomach sank as he saw the headline on the screen, "Is Marcus Johnson exploiting his mother's pain for financial gain?" The article, published by a conservative news outlet, suggested that Marcus was using the lawsuit to advance his career, positioning himself as a civil rights crusader while lining his pockets with settlement money. Marcus gritted his teeth, his anger flaring. This was exactly the kind of smear tactic he had expected, but seeing it in print made his blood boil. They were trying to turn the public against him, to make it seem like he didn't care about his mother or about the cause of justice. "Don't let it get to you," Lydia said softly. "They're grasping at straws." "I know," Marcus replied, handing the phone back to her. "But it's hard not to feel like they're getting under my skin." Lydia hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Your mother called," she said. She sounded tired. "Maybe you should take a break. Spend some time with her." Marcus nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on the legal battle that he hadn't spent as much time with his mother as he should have. The stress of the case was wearing on her, and he knew she needed him now more than ever. That evening, Marcus visited his mother at her home. Martha was sitting in her armchair by the window, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as Marcus entered, her face lighting up with a tired smile. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked, sitting down beside her. Martha sighed, setting the teacup down on the small table beside her. "I'm tired, Marcus," she admitted. "All this attention. It's too much. I never wanted to be in the spotlight like this." Marcus reached over and took her hand, his expression softening. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry, but we're doing this for a reason. This fight, it's important. I just don't want you to lose yourself in it," Martha said gently. "You've always been so strong, but I can see how much this is weighing on you." Marcus looked down at their joined hands, his jaw tightening. "I can't stop now, Mom." "Not after everything we've been through." Martha nodded, though Marcus could see the weariness in her eyes. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself," she said softly. "I don't want to see you burn out." "I promise," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. The weeks dragged on, and the stress of the lawsuit continued to build. Marcus spent long hours in his office, working late into the night as he prepared for the upcoming trial. His legal team was strong, but the bank's defense was relentless, throwing everything they had at him in an attempt to wear him down. One evening, after another grueling day of preparation, Marcus received a phone call from Martha's neighbor, Mrs. Robinson. Her voice was filled with concern. "Marcus, I think you need to come over, Mrs. Robinson said. Your mother collapsed. We've called an ambulance." Marcus' heart leaped into his throat. "What happened? Is she okay?" "I'm not sure, Mrs. Robinson replied. "She's conscious, but she's weak. You need to get here right away." Marcus was out the door within seconds, his mind racing as he sped through the streets to his mother's house. When he arrived, the ambulance was already there, and paramedics were loading Martha onto a stretcher. "Mom," Marcus called, rushing to her side. Martha looked up at him, her face pale but her eyes still filled with that same quiet strength. "I'm okay, Marcus," she said weakly. I think I overdid it." The paramedics assured Marcus that her vitals were stable, but they needed to take her to the hospital for observation. Marcus followed the ambulance, his heart pounding in his chest. The guilt washed over him in waves. Had the stress of the lawsuit been too much for her? Had he pushed her too hard? At the hospital, Marcus sat by his mother's bedside, holding her hand as she rested. The doctors said she had experienced a mild heart issue, likely brought on by stress, and that she would need to stay overnight for monitoring. As he sat there in the quiet of the hospital room, Marcus felt a deep sense of failure settle over him. He had promised his mother that they would get through this together, but now she was lying in a hospital bed because of him. When Martha finally woke, she looked over at Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus," she said softly, "don't stop. Don't let them win." Marcus blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I won't, Mom. I promise." A few days later, Marcus received a call from the bank's legal team. They had heard about Martha's hospitalization, and now they were offering a new settlement, this time with a larger sum of money and a public apology. It was more than they had ever offered before, and it was clear that they were desperate to avoid the trial. Marcus sat in his office, staring at the settlement offer on his desk. It was tempting. The money would more than cover Jason's college tuition, and the apology could help restore his mother's dignity. It felt like a victory, but something about it didn't sit right with Marcus. He thought of his mother, of the way she had looked at him in that hospital bed. "Don't stop. Don't let them win." The settlement was a victory on the surface, but Marcus knew that it wouldn't bring about the real change they were fighting for. If they took the money, the bank would move on, and nothing would change. With a heavy heart, Marcus made his decision. He picked up the phone and called the bank's legal team. "We're not accepting the settlement," Marcus said firmly. "Well, see you in court." The day of the trial finally arrived. Marcus sat beside his legal team at the plaintiff's table, his face a mask of calm determination. It had been months of preparation, months of gathering evidence, taking depositions, and weathering the relentless attempts by the bank to discredit him and his mother. But now they were ready. Now it was time to fight. Across the aisle, the bank's legal team sat with steely expressions. Carol Stevens, the branch manager who had been at the center of the incident, sat next to the bank's lead attorney, Daniel Collins, her face pale and drawn. The weight of the lawsuit had taken a toll on her, and she knew that her career hung in the balance. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras flashing as they snapped photos of Marcus and his mother, who sat just behind him, a quiet but resolute presence. Civil rights advocates and community members who had rallied behind Marcus and Martha filled the gallery, their faces tense with anticipation. The judge, Honorable Alice Matthews, called the court to order, her voice ringing out over the low murmur of the crowd. "We are here today to hear the case of Johnson vs. First Freedom Bank. Counsel, please present your opening statements." Marcus attorney David Green rose from his seat, his expression calm but serious as he approached the jury. He had been working with Marcus for months, and he knew how important this case was, not just for Marcus and Martha, but for the larger issue of racial and age-based discrimination in the banking industry. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David began, his voice steady, This case is about more than just a simple banking transaction. This is about the dignity and respect that all people are entitled to, regardless of their race, their age, or their background. What happened to Mrs. Martha Johnson was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of discrimination that we see all too often in institutions across this country. David paced slowly in front of the jury, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. The evidence we will present in this trial will show that First Freedom Bank not only failed to treat Mrs. Johnson with the respect she deserved, but that their actions were rooted in discriminatory practices that have gone unchecked for far too long. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. We ask you to hold them accountable. We ask you to send a message that no one should ever be made to feel less than simply because of who they are. As David returned to his seat, Marcus felt a surge of pride. They were finally being heard. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the verge of real justice. Next, it was Daniel Collins' turn to address the jury. He rose from his seat, his expression sharp and confident as he walked to the front of the room. His strategy was clear frame, the bank's actions as standard procedure, and paint Marcus as a man exploiting the system for personal gain. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Daniel began, his voice smooth, what we have here is not a case of discrimination. What we have is a misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion by a man seeking to make a name for himself at the expense of a respected institution. Daniel gestured toward Marcus, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Johnson would have you believe that his mother was a victim of discrimination, but the evidence will show that the bank was simply following its policies that are in place to protect all customers. There was no malice, no ill intent, and certainly no discrimination. He turned to face the jury directly. We ask that you look at the facts, not the emotion. We ask that you see this case for what it truly is, a baseless accusation that threatens to tarnish the reputation of a good institution. Daniel's voice carried the practiced assurance of a man who had fought many battles in the courtroom. But as he returned to his seat, Marcus could sense the cracks in the bank's defense. The jury hadn't bought into his narrative, not yet. The trial moved quickly, with both sides calling witnesses to the stand. Marcus' team presented testimonies from bank customers who had experienced similar treatment, elderly customers, people of color, all of whom had felt the sting of condescension and suspicion when they walked through the doors of First Freedom Bank. Each testimony painted a picture of a bank that operated under unspoken biases, a place where certain people were treated as outsiders. Martha herself took the stand, her voice soft but steady as she recounted the day she had tried to cash her check. Marcus sat just a few feet away, watching as his mother spoke with quiet dignity about the way she had been humiliated, the way the bank had made her feel like she didn't belong. I've been a customer of that bank for more than 30 years, Martha said, her hands resting lightly on the wooden rail in front of her. I've always been treated with respect until that day. That day, they looked at me like I was nothing, like I didn't deserve to be there. There was a tremor in her voice, but she held herself tall. I'm not asking for much. I just want to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. As Martha stepped down from the witness stand, there wasn't a sound in the courtroom. Even the reporters, who had been typing furiously on their laptops, paused for a moment to absorb her words. The bank, in turn, called their employees to testify. Carol Stevens was one of them, and though she tried to explain that she had been following the bank's anti-fraud policies, it was clear that the jury wasn't convinced. Her voice wavered, and the more she spoke, the more it became apparent that her actions had been driven by fear of making a mistake, fear of violating the bank's rigid policies, but not necessarily by malice. Still, it wasn't enough. The damage had been done. After days of testimonies, cross-examinations, and legal arguments, the time had come for the jury to deliberate. Marcus sat in the courtroom beside his mother, his heart pounding in his chest as the jury filed out to begin their discussions. This was it. Everything they had fought for, everything they had endured, all came down to this moment. Martha reached over and placed her hand on Marcus' arm. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "I'm proud of you. You've done everything you could." Marcus nodded, though his throat felt tight with emotion. He had fought for his mother, but he had also fought for something larger. He had fought for justice, for dignity, for the countless people who had been treated as though they didn't belong in places like First Freedom Bank. And now all they could do was wait. The hours dragged on. Marcus and Martha waited in a small conference room with their legal team, the tension thick in the air. Marcus paced back and forth, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, while Martha sat quietly, her eyes closed as she tried to remain calm. Finally, the door opened, and David entered the room, his expression unreadable. "The jury's back," he said. "It's time?" Marcus felt his heart leap into his throat as he followed his mother and the rest of the team back into the courtroom. The air was electric with anticipation as the jury filed back into their seats, the foreman holding the folded piece of paper that contained the verdict. Judge Matthews called the court to order, and the room fell silent. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, stood and nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The judge gestured for him to proceed, and the foreman unfolded the paper, his voice steady as he read aloud. "In the case of Johnson v. First Freedom Bank, we find the defendant guilty of racial and age-based discrimination." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Marcus' heart swelled with a mixture of relief and triumph. They had done it! They had won! The foreman continued. "We award the plaintiff compensatory damages in the amount of $2 million. Marcus glanced at his mother, whose eyes were glistening with tears. She looked at him, her expression a mix of pride and quiet gratitude. "You did it," she whispered. But Marcus shook his head, his gaze steady. "No, Mom," he said softly. "We did it." The days that followed the verdict were a whirlwind. News of the case spread across the country, and Marcus found himself being hailed as a hero in the fight against discrimination in the financial sector. Civil rights organizations praised the outcome, and the public response was overwhelmingly supportive. The victory wasn't just about the money, though the damages would ensure that Martha and Jason would never have to worry about financial stability again. The real victory was in the message they had sent. First Freedom Bank had been held accountable, and other institutions across the country were put on notice discrimination would not be tolerated. First Freedom Bank, now facing significant public backlash, issued a formal apology, not only to Martha, but to all of its customers. They promised sweeping changes within their organization, including mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, revised policies to ensure fair treatment for all customers, and a renewed commitment to diversity and inclusion. Carol Stevens resigned from her position, taking responsibility for her role in the incident. The bank's board of directors launched an internal investigation, and several high-level executives were replaced as part of the effort to rebuild trust with the community. For Marcus, the victory in court marked the beginning of a new chapter. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and he was determined to continue his work as an advocate for those who had been marginalized and mistreated. He founded the Johnson Initiative for Equality in Banking, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating discrimination in financial institutions and providing legal support for victims of unfair treatment. The initiative quickly gained traction, with banks and credit unions across the country reaching out to partner with Marcus in their efforts to improve their practices. Martha's quiet victory. As for Martha, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. She continued to live in her quiet home, surrounded by the love of her family. Jason was thriving at Harvard, and the knowledge that she had played a role in securing his future filled her with a deep sense of peace. One afternoon, as Marcus sat with her in the garden, Martha looked at her son, her heart swelling with pride. "You've done something incredible," she said softly. "You've made the world a better place." Marcus smiled, shaking his head. "I learned from the best." Several months after the trial, a plaque was installed inside the lobby of First Freedom Bank. It read, "In honor of Mrs. Martha Johnson, whose courage and dignity remind us all that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." The plaque served as a reminder to the bank's employees and customers that dignity was not negotiable. It was a promise that what had happened to Martha would never happen again. As Marcus and Martha stood before the plaque, the sun streaming in through the glass windows, they knew that this was more than just a victory for them. It was a victory for justice, for equality, and for the belief that everyone, regardless of their background, deserved to be treated with respect. They had fought the good fight, and they had won. But more than that, they had left a lasting legacy, a legacy of change that would continue long after they were gone. As Marcus and Martha's journey ends, their fight for dignity and justice serves as a reminder to all of us that standing up for what's right can create lasting change. If you were inspired by this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful and uplifting stories like this one. We share content that highlights courage, perseverance, and the importance of fighting for fairness in everyday life. Hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Let us know in the comments what you think and share how this story resonated with you. Together, we can continue the fight for justice, one story at a time.
"We'll fight this, Dad," Ethan said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll find a way." Mark looked at him, a small flicker of hope in his eyes. "I don't know if we can, Ethan." "Yes, we can," Ethan insisted. "We're not alone anymore. Sarah's mom can help, and David will know what to do. We're going to win this." Mark stared at his son for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said softly. "We'll fight." But even as the words left his mouth, Ethan could see the fear behind his father's eyes. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move could send them plummeting into disaster. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Ethan's life. The legal battle with Philip drained what little resources they had left, and the stress weighed heavily on both of them. Mark spent hours meeting with David, trying to prepare their defense, but the odds seemed stacked against them. Ethan's struggles at school continued as well. Although Logan was still suspended, his absence didn't stop the undercurrent of hostility from some of the other students. Rumors swirled about Ethan and his father, fueled by Philip's smear campaign. The whispers about their lies and manipulation were relentless. One afternoon, as Ethan walked through the courtyard, a group of students blocked his path. One of them, a tall boy with a smug grin, stepped forward, tossing a fake bill at Ethan's feet. "Maybe you should give this to your dad," the boy sneered. "Looks like he needs it." The other students laughed, their voices harsh and cruel. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, the anger boiling inside him. He wanted to hit the boy, to scream at him, but he knew that would only make things worse. Instead, he stepped around them and kept walking, his heart pounding in his chest. But the pain of their words lingered, gnawing at him long after the incident had passed. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The bullying, the lawsuit, the fear of losing everything, it was all too much. He wanted to be strong for his father, for himself. But right now, he didn't feel strong. He felt like he was drowning. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan wondered if they could really win this fight. The day of the final court hearing had arrived, and the tension in the air was thick with anticipation. Ethan could feel his heart racing as he walked into the courthouse beside his father, Mark. This was it, the moment they had been building toward for weeks. Everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, was on the line. Mark's lawyer, David Emerson, met them at the entrance, his expression grim but resolute. He had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, poring over documents and witness statements, piecing together a defense that would expose the corruption at Harrowfield Academy. Inside the courtroom, Philip Andrews sat at the plaintiff's table, his high-priced legal team flanking him like a protective wall. His face was stone cold, but the glint of smug confidence in his eyes made Ethan's stomach churn. Philip wasn't just trying to win a lawsuit, he was trying to destroy their lives. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as the proceedings began. David rose first, his voice steady as he laid out their case. Philip's defamation lawsuit was nothing more than a desperate attempt to silence the truth about the corruption at Harrowfield. He presented the evidence. Sarah had provided documents showing financial misconduct, manipulation of scholarship funds, and illegal deals orchestrated by Philip and his family. But Philip's team was ruthless. They attacked every piece of evidence, questioning its validity, its legality. They painted Mark as a bitter man looking for revenge, someone who had concocted this entire scheme out of desperation. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, feeling his frustration build with every argument Philip's team made. They were twisting the truth, distorting everything. He wanted to scream, to tell the court how wrong they were, but all he could do was sit and watch as David tried to navigate the legal minefield. Then came the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that could turn the tide in their favor. David pulled out the final piece of evidence, the recording of Philip and his business partner, Gregory Blake, discussing their illegal activities. It was a recording Sarah had obtained through her mother's connections, and it was damning. The courtroom held its breath as the recording played, Philip's voice echoing through the room. "We've funneled enough money through these fake accounts to keep the school running smoothly," Philip's voice said. "No one's going to find out, and if they do, we'll bury them. People like Mark Carter don't stand a chance." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Ethan saw the color drain from Philip's face, his smug confidence evaporating in an instant. The judge's eyes narrowed, and even Philip's own lawyers looked shaken by the revelation. David stood tall, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "Your Honor, this recording proves that Philip Andrews and Gregory Blake have been engaging in illegal financial activities, using Harrowfield Academy as their cover. This lawsuit isn't about defamation, it's about silencing the truth." The judge called for a recess, and the room buzzed with tension as everyone processed what had just been revealed. Ethan felt a surge of hope. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they might actually win. But Philip wasn't going down without a fight. As the recess ended, Philip's legal team made a desperate move. They claimed the recording was obtained illegally and demanded that it be thrown out. The judge, however, allowed it to stand, recognizing the overwhelming public interest in the case. Philip's expression hardened, and Ethan knew that whatever happened next, Philip would try to retaliate. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal. The judge returned to the bench after the final recess, the tension in the courtroom almost unbearable. The evidence against Philip Andrews was overwhelming. His legal team had done everything they could to discredit the Carters, but the truth had come out, and now the scales were tipping in their favor. Ethan could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as the judge began to speak. "In light of the evidence presented, it is clear that the plaintiff's defamation claim is unfounded," the judge said, her voice firm and authoritative. "The court finds that Mr. Mark Carter and his son, Ethan Carter, have acted in good faith to expose serious misconduct within Harrowfield Academy. As such, the defamation lawsuit is dismissed." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the evidence of financial improprieties on the part of Mr. Philip Andrews and his associates, I am recommending that a formal investigation be launched into the governance of Harrowfield Academy and the handling of its scholarship funds. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the judge's words sank in. Philip's face was ashen, his eyes wide with shock. His lawyers scrambled to confer with one another, but the damage had been done. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back. Ethan turned to his father, a smile breaking across his face. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and pride. "Yeah," he said softly, "we did." As they left the courtroom, the weight that had been pressing down on them for so long finally lifted. Outside, reporters swarmed around them, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward as they shouted questions. But all Ethan could focus on was the sense of victory coursing through him. They had fought back against a corrupt system, and they had won. Later that night, the Carters sat at their kitchen table, the familiar surroundings now feeling like a sanctuary. Mark poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands steady for the first time in weeks. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," Mark said quietly, looking across the table at his son. "You never gave up. Even when things got tough, you stayed strong." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "I learned it from you, Dad." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the victory still fresh, the relief still sinking in. But even as they celebrated, they knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation into Harrowfield would bring more changes, and there were still challenges ahead. But for now, they had earned a moment of peace. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial sent shockwaves through Harrowfield Academy. Philip Andrews resigned from the school board in disgrace, and the investigation into the financial misconduct at the school uncovered even more corruption. Several other members of the board were implicated, and a complete overhaul of the school's leadership was announced. A new principal, Michael Harrison, was brought in to replace Principal Jameson, who had quietly stepped down amid the scandal. Harrison had a reputation for fairness and integrity, and he was determined to rebuild Harrowfield from the ground up. One of his first acts as principal was to implement sweeping changes to the school's scholarship program, ensuring that students from all backgrounds were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. Uniform costs were revised, and new policies were put in place to prevent the kind of elitism that had plagued the school for so long. Ethan noticed the changes immediately. The atmosphere at school was different, lighter, more inclusive. The whispers and stares that had once followed him everywhere were gone, replaced by nods of respect from students who had seen the truth come to light. Even Logan Andrews, who had returned to school after his suspension, seemed to have been humbled by the events. He kept his distance from Ethan, no longer the arrogant bully he had once been. And while they would never be friends, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that the old Harrowfield was gone and a new era had begun. Ethan continued to excel in his studies, but now his success wasn't tainted by the weight of the bullying or the fear of not fitting in. He had earned his place at Harrowfield, and no one could take that away from him. One afternoon, as he walked through the newly renovated school courtyard, Ethan found Sarah sitting on a bench, her nose buried in a book. "Hey," he said, sitting down beside her. She looked up, smiling. "Hey." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the warm sun shining down on them. After everything they had been through, it felt surreal to finally have peace. "Can you believe it?" Sarah said after a moment. "Everything's changing." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe." She closed her book and turned to him, her expression serious. "You did this, Ethan. You and your dad. You changed things." Ethan smiled, but it was a humble smile. "We couldn't have done it without you. Or your mom." Sarah looked down at her hands, her smile fading slightly. "She's proud of you, you know. She wishes she could be here to see it." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Sarah's mother had lost everything because of the Andrews family, but in a way they had honored her fight by bringing the truth to light. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Ethan and Sarah stood up, heading back into the school. But as they walked, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, a feeling that the worst was behind them. Several months later, Harrowfield Academy held a special assembly to mark the beginning of a new chapter for the school. Parents, students, and teachers filled the auditorium, the excitement in the air palpable. Mark sat in the front row, watching as Ethan walked onto the stage. He had been chosen to give the opening speech, a recognition of the role he and his father had played in transforming the school. Ethan stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the sea of faces. But this time, the nervousness that had once gripped him was gone. He was no longer the scared boy who had been bullied and humiliated. He was strong, confident, and ready to lead. "Good morning," Ethan began, his voice clear and steady. "When I first came to Harrowfield, I didn't know if I would ever belong here. I didn't know if I would make it through the year. But what I learned is that belonging isn't about where you come from or how much money you have. It's about who you are." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This school is different now," Ethan continued, "because we fought for something better. We fought for fairness, for respect, for equality. And today, we're all part of that change." The audience erupted into applause, and as Ethan stepped back from the podium, he felt a sense of pride he had never known before. After the assembly, Ethan joined his father in the courtyard, the warm sun shining down on them. They stood together, watching as students from all walks of life mingled and laughed, the barriers that had once divided them now gone. "You did it," Mark said, his voice filled with pride. "You changed everything." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "We did it, Dad. Together." And as they walked away, hand in hand, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of a brighter, more hopeful future for both of them. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of courage, resilience, and the fight for justice. If you found inspiration in Ethan and Mark's story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories about hope and perseverance. We believe that, like Ethan, everyone has the power to change their world if they stand strong and never give up. Share this story with friends and family, and let us know in the comments. What would you do if you were in Ethan's shoes? Stay tuned for more inspiring stories where determination and heart lead to unforgettable victories. See you in the next one.
We helped each other. As they sat there in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustling of leaves, Luke realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a sense of belonging, a deeper connection to the people around him, and a renewed understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. The story of Edith's struggle and her eventual recovery had touched more lives than either of them could have imagined. The people of Riverbrook had rallied around her, showing what it meant to truly care for one another. And in the process, they had reminded Luke of the importance of small, everyday acts of kindness, the kind of kindness that could save lives. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, Edith leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling with contentment. "It's a beautiful day," she said softly. Luke nodded, his heart full. "It really is." And in that moment, Luke knew that no matter what the future held, he and Edith would face it together, surrounded by the strength of their community and the unbreakable bond they had formed. Sometimes, the most unexpected connections can shape our lives in profound ways. If you've been moved by this story and want to hear more heartwarming tales like this one, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future updates. Every story has the power to inspire, and we have plenty more to share with you. Join us on this journey of storytelling, empathy, and community. Be a part of something bigger by subscribing, and together we can spread positivity, one story at a time. Let me know how it goes. In the months that followed, Ryan spearheaded a new task force within the department aimed at ensuring the responsible use of technology in policing. The Ethical Policing Technology Initiative (EPTI) was designed to oversee how new tools were implemented, making sure they adhered to strict privacy standards and weren't being used in a discriminatory manner. Ryan worked closely with civil liberties groups, tech experts, and community leaders to develop guidelines that ensured transparency and accountability. Officers were required to undergo specialized training on how to use these tools ethically, and new oversight measures were put in place to monitor their deployment. The program wasn't without its critics. Some officers complained that the new rules made their jobs harder, while certain tech companies pushed back against what they saw as unnecessary restrictions. But Ryan stood firm, knowing that without proper oversight, the technology could do more harm than good. During one particularly tense department meeting, an officer raised his hand, frustration evident in his voice. "With all due respect, Deputy Chief," he began, "why are we handcuffing ourselves? This technology can help us catch criminals faster. Why put so many restrictions on it?" Ryan met the officer's gaze, understanding the concern but remaining resolute. "Because our job isn't just to catch criminals," he said. "Our job is to protect the people, and that means protecting their rights too. If we start sacrificing privacy and civil liberties in the name of efficiency, then we're not doing our jobs. We're just cutting corners." The room was silent for a moment, and Ryan could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. It was a tough balancing act, but Ryan knew it was necessary. The future of policing wasn't about brute force or unchecked surveillance. It was about thoughtful, ethical approaches that respected the people they served. 2 years later, the Ethical Policing Technology Initiative had become a model for departments across the country. Ryan had been invited to speak at several national conferences, sharing the lessons they had learned about balancing public safety with civil liberties. The success of the initiative had solidified his reputation as a forward-thinking leader in law enforcement reform. Jordan, too, had continued his advocacy work, pushing for nationwide adoption of similar standards. The two men, despite their different approaches, remained close friends and collaborators, each pushing the other to do better. One evening, after a long day, Ryan received a message from Jordan dinner at my place. When Ryan arrived, Jordan was already grilling steaks on the back porch. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air as they sat down to catch up. "You know, I never thought we'd be here," Jordan said as they ate. "When we started all this, I didn't think we'd actually get to a point where the system would listen to us." Ryan smiled. "I think we both underestimated the power of persistence." Jordan laughed. "You're right about that. But we're not done yet, are we?" "No," Ryan said, his tone serious. "We're not. But we're making progress." They clinked their beer bottles together, a silent toast to the years of hard work and the victories they had earned. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but they had made a difference one step at a time. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Ryan and Jordan sat in comfortable silence, watching the world they had helped shape. The challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, had all been worth it. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Ryan couldn't help but think about the young officers coming up through the ranks, the ones who would carry on the work he had started. Officers like Naomi Green, who now led a unit focused on community engagement, were the future of policing. They represented a new generation that believed in fairness, justice, and the importance of doing things the right way. "I think the future's in good hands," Ryan said, more to himself than to Jordan. Jordan looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think it is." The two men sat back, content in the knowledge that while their work was never truly done, they had laid a foundation that would stand the test of time. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there would always be hope for a better, more just world. A few more years passed, and Ryan Carter's career had reached heights he never imagined when he first joined the force. Now, as the chief of police, Ryan was responsible not only for the reforms that had already taken place, but also for leading the department through new social, technological, and ethical challenges. His success as a reformer had made him a widely respected figure, but it had also placed him under intense scrutiny. Every move he made, every decision he authorized, was dissected by the media and the public. The new debate consuming the city was centered around the rise in community-led safety initiatives. Many neighborhoods, particularly those that had experienced tense relations with the police in the past, were advocating for more localized, community-based public safety programs. These initiatives emphasized conflict resolution, mental health intervention, and restorative justice over traditional policing methods. Ryan understood the community's desire to have a more direct role in keeping their neighborhoods safe. After all, much of the progress they had made over the years was due to increased collaboration between the police and the public. But there were concerns within the department about the implications of scaling back traditional policing in favor of untested community models. One afternoon, as Ryan sat reviewing proposals for community-led initiatives, his deputy, Lieutenant Denise Martin, walked into his office. Denise had been one of Ryan's strongest allies during the reform years, helping him navigate the pushback from the old guard while building support among the rank-and-file officers. "Chief, you've seen the latest push from the city council, right?" Denise asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Ryan nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Yeah, I've been going over it. Community Safety Initiative, they're calling it. They want to divert some funding from the police budget to support it." Denise frowned. "I get where they're coming from, but are they really ready for this? We're talking about removing traditional law enforcement presence in some of the most at-risk neighborhoods. Are we setting them up to fail?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before responding. "I don't think we should look at it as us versus them. The goal is the same: keeping people safe. The way we've done things isn't the only way to do it. But if we're going to make this work, we need to be partners in the process." Denise nodded, her expression softening. "You think we can pull that off?" Ryan smiled slightly. "We've done harder things." A few days later, Ryan met with Councilwoman Elena Reyes, one of the main architects of the Community Safety Initiative. The two had worked together closely on previous reforms, but this new initiative was pushing them into uncharted territory. Still, Ryan was determined to keep the lines of communication open. Chief Carter, Councilwoman Reyes, greeted him warmly as they sat down in her office. "Thank you for taking the time. I know this isn't an easy conversation." Ryan smiled. "That's why we're here to have the hard conversations. We both want the same thing, safer communities." Reyes nodded, her tone more serious now. "Exactly. But we believe that safety doesn't always have to come from a police presence. These community programs have been shown to reduce violence and increase trust between residents. We want to give people the tools to resolve conflicts without always having to rely on law enforcement." Ryan took a deep breath. "I understand that, and I think there's a lot of potential here. But we also need to make sure that when people call for help, they get the response they need. There are situations where trained law enforcement is necessary, when violence escalates or when people's lives are at risk. We can't ignore that reality." Reyes leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "That's why we need your help. We're not talking about eliminating police presence, we're talking about complementing it. Working together with the community instead of always being the first line of defense." Ryan nodded. "I'm open to that. Let's figure out how we can build this partnership. But we need clear guidelines on when the police should step in and when the community can handle things on their own. We also need to make sure that officers aren't feeling like they're being sidelined. If we're going to shift some of the responsibility, we need to bring everyone to the table." Reyes smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." Over the next few months, the Community Safety Initiative took shape. Ryan and his team worked closely with the City Council and community leaders to design a pilot program that would test the new model in several neighborhoods. The initiative focused on training community members in conflict resolution, mental health first aid, and de-escalation tactics, while keeping a close line of communication with the police for situations that required their involvement. Jordan, ever the advocate for grassroots solutions, was thrilled with the progress. "This is exactly what we've been talking about for years," Jordan said one evening over dinner with Ryan. "Empowering the community to take ownership of their own safety. If this works, it could be a game changer." Ryan nodded, though he remained cautious. "I want it to work as much as you do. But we have to be prepared for things to go wrong, too. If the community doesn't feel supported, or if the police feel like they're being cut out of the process, this could backfire." Jordan raised his glass. "That's why we have you keeping everyone on the same page." Ryan chuckled, clinking his glass against Jordan's. "Let's hope it's enough." As the program rolled out, there were successes and setbacks. In some neighborhoods, the community-led safety efforts resulted in a noticeable decrease in calls for police intervention. People began resolving disputes among themselves, and trust between residents and law enforcement improved. But in other areas, old tensions resurfaced. Some officers felt their authority was being undermined, while certain residents still feared police involvement, leading to hesitations in calling for help when it was really needed. Ryan worked tirelessly to address these issues, meeting with officers and community leaders, adjusting the program as needed. He knew this was part of the growing pains of any new initiative, but he also knew they couldn't afford to let the early successes slip away. The true test of the Community Safety Initiative came one night when a major confrontation erupted between two rival groups in one of the pilot neighborhoods. The conflict had escalated quickly, with rumors of violence spreading through social media. Normally, the police would have responded immediately, but this time, the community leaders who had been trained through the initiative decided to step in first. Ryan and his team were on standby, monitoring the situation closely. He had already instructed the officers to be ready to intervene if things got out of hand. But he was hoping that the community could de-escalate the situation without the need for force. For hours, tensions ran high as the trained mediators worked to calm both sides. The situation was touch and go, but just as things seemed like they were about to erupt into violence, a breakthrough happened. The leaders of both groups agreed to meet, with the mediators acting as go-betweens, and after a tense negotiation, they reached a resolution without a single arrest or injury. When Ryan received the call that the situation had been resolved peacefully, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. "We did it," Denise said, her voice filled with awe as she stood beside Ryan in the precinct's command center. Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "The community did it. We were there to back them up, but they handled it on their own." Jordan called Ryan that night, excited about the news. "This is huge, man, proof that this model works. People are going to take notice." Ryan smiled but remained grounded. "It's a big step, but we have to stay focused. This isn't a one-time thing. We need to keep refining the process, making sure that both the community and the police are working together." Months later, the success of the pilot program had attracted national attention. Cities across the country were interested in replicating the model, and Ryan was once again at the forefront of a new wave of reform. This time, the focus wasn't just on how police could change, but on how entire communities could take ownership of their safety while still collaborating with law enforcement. Jordan, as always, remained by Ryan's side, helping to push the legal framework for these initiatives across the country. The two friends had come a long way from that fateful night they had been pulled over. Their partnership had transformed the city and was now shaping the future of public safety nationwide. As Ryan sat in his office preparing for yet another interview with a national news outlet about the program's success, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But they had built something lasting, something that would change lives for generations to come. Looking out the window at the city he had dedicated his life to, Ryan smiled. The work was never done, but for the first time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. They had started with a fight for justice, but now they were building a future of hope, partnership, and community-led safety. And as long as people were willing to work together, Ryan knew that anything was possible. A few years had passed since the Community Safety Initiative had been fully implemented across the city. The initiative had matured, becoming an example of how community and law enforcement could work together in harmony without one undermining the other. While there were still challenges, the overwhelming success had drawn attention from policymakers, activists, and law enforcement agencies across the country. Ryan Carter, now nearing retirement age, was in a reflective mood. After decades of service, he knew his time as the city's police chief was coming to an end. And while he looked forward to stepping back from the pressures of the job, he also felt the weight of leaving behind a legacy. Jordan, meanwhile, had taken his advocacy work to a national level. He was now leading efforts to pass federal legislation aimed at reshaping policing standards across the United States. They were both busy men, but their friendship remained as strong as ever. One evening, as Ryan sat at his kitchen table going over the plans for his final year in office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jordan Need to talk. "Big news! Let's meet tomorrow." Ryan smiled to himself. Jordan always had big news. Over the years, they had shared so many victories, setbacks, and countless moments of celebration and frustration. But it was their shared vision that had kept them moving forward. The next day, Ryan met Jordan at a small diner they used to frequent in their early days as young professionals. It felt nostalgic, sitting in the same booth where they had once dreamed of making a difference. Now, years later, they had done more than dream, they had transformed their city. "All right, Jordan, what's this big news?" Ryan asked as he settled into the booth. Jordan leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "I've been talking with some of the top people in Washington. They want to take what we've done here with the Community Safety Initiative and turn it into a national pilot program. It'll be the first time this kind of community-driven public safety model has been tested on such a large scale." Ryan sat back, absorbing the news. "National pilot program? That's huge. What's the plan?" Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "They're looking for cities willing to try it. We'd take the model we built and expand it, tweaking it based on the unique needs of different communities. They want to bring me on as a national advisor, but more importantly, they want your input." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "My input? I'm about to retire, Jordan. I'm not sure. I'm the guy for this." Jordan shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You're exactly the guy for this. You've seen this work on the ground. You've lived it. And the fact that you've been in law enforcement gives you the credibility to convince other departments that this isn't just some idealistic dream, it's real. And it works. Ryan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It's a big ask. I've spent my entire career in this city. I'm not sure I'm ready for something on that scale. Jordan leaned in, his voice quieter now. I know you're ready to step back, but think about it. This could be the final piece of the puzzle scaling this idea across the country. You could retire knowing that what we built here is making an impact everywhere. Just give it some thought. Ryan didn't respond immediately, but he knew Jordan had a point. The work they had started in their city had the potential to be something even greater. But after years of leading a department, Ryan wasn't sure if he had the energy for another national fight. You'll think about it, Ryan said finally, his tone cautious. Jordan smiled. That's all I'm asking. As Ryan approached the end of his tenure as police chief, he began preparing his department for the transition. He had mentored several officers who were strong candidates to succeed him, including Lieutenant Denise Martin, who had proven herself to be a capable leader and a dedicated advocate for the community first approach they had built. One afternoon, Ryan called Denise into his office. Denise, you've been one of the strongest leaders in this department for years, Ryan said, looking across his desk at her. I've been thinking a lot about the future, and I believe you're ready to take the reins. Denise's eyes widened slightly, though she had suspected this moment was coming. Chief, that means a lot. I've learned so much from you, and I believe in what we've built together. But I know there's still so much more to do. Ryan nodded, his face thoughtful. That's exactly why I know you're the right person for this. You've always been driven by the same things that pushed me: justice, fairness, and a commitment to serving the people. This department needs someone like you to keep it moving forward. Denise sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ryan's words settling on her shoulders. Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Ryan said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. And remember, you're not doing this alone. Lean on your team, and don't be afraid to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard. As Denise left the office, Ryan felt a sense of peace. The future of the department was in good hands. It was time for him to step back and let the next generation lead. With his retirement officially announced, Ryan took a few weeks to reflect on Jordan's proposal. The idea of taking the community safety initiative to a national level intrigued him, but he was also ready for a quieter life after years of public service. He spent more time with his family, enjoying the slower pace, but the thought of leaving the work behind nagged at him. One evening, Ryan found himself sitting on his back porch, the sun setting over the city skyline. The phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Jordan. Still waiting on you, old man. Time's ticking. Ryan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Jordan never gave up on a fight. That night, Ryan made his decision. He wasn't ready to walk away from it all just yet. The work they had started was too important, and if there was a chance to make a lasting impact on a national scale, he wanted to be a part of it. The next morning, Ryan called Jordan. All right, I'm in. Let's do this. Jordan's voice was filled with triumph. I knew you couldn't resist. This is going to be big, Ryan. We're about to change the game. With the decision made, Ryan found himself in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. The national pilot program was being rolled out in 10 major cities, and Ryan was instrumental in helping to shape its implementation. His experience in building the initiative from the ground up gave him a unique perspective, and his input was invaluable as they adapted the program to fit the specific needs of different communities. Jordan, as always, was right there with him, leading the charge from the legal side and ensuring that the program stayed true to its original goals of fairness, justice, and community empowerment. As the months passed, Ryan found himself energized by the work. He had thought he was ready for retirement, but this new mission gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were immense, but so were the rewards.
He watched his communities begin to embrace the new model as officers and residents, and as the seeds of change spread from city to city.
2 years into the national pilot program, the results were undeniable. The Community Safety Initiative had reduced violent incidents, built stronger bonds between law enforcement and residents, and empowered communities to take control of their own safety. The program was hailed as a success, and plans were already underway to expand it to even more cities. Ryan, now in his mid-60s, knew it was finally time to step back for good. His work was done. He had helped lay the foundation for a new era of policing and community collaboration, and he had no doubt that the leaders who followed would continue to build on that legacy. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the latest round of national reforms being signed into law, Ryan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a better future. And now that future was being realized. Jordan stood beside him, grinning. "Well, old man, we did it." Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting both pride and relief. "Yeah, we did." They stood there together, watching the crowds below, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The road had been long, the challenges immense, but they had built something lasting, something that would shape the future for generations to come. And in that moment, Ryan knew that while his journey as a public servant was over, his legacy of justice, reform, and hope would live on. Ryan Carter had officially retired from his role as Chief of Police and had successfully completed his work on the National Pilot Program. Now, standing on the balcony of his home in Denver, he gazed out over the city that had shaped his life. After decades of service, he was finally stepping away from the day-to-day grind of law enforcement. But it didn't feel like the end. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. Without the constant pressures of his old position, Ryan found himself reconnecting with old hobbies and passions that he hadn't had time for in years. He spent more time with his family, his wife Elena, and their 2 grown children, Tyler and Sophia. The past few years had been especially hard on them with Ryan's intense focus on work, and now he wanted to make up for lost time. One sunny afternoon, Ryan and Elena took a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in what felt like ages. The air was crisp, the leaves falling gently around them, and Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. "You finally have time to slow down," Elena said with a smile as they strolled along the path. Ryan nodded. "It feels strange, but it's nice. I think I forgot what it was like to just be present." Elena squeezed his hand. "You've earned it, but I have a feeling you're not done yet." Ryan smiled, knowing she was right. Even in retirement, his mind still buzzed with thoughts about how he could continue making a difference. But this time, he would do it on his terms, without the constant demands of his old job weighing him down. A few months into his retirement, Ryan was approached by a local university to teach a course on ethical leadership and policing reform. The idea intrigued him. He had spent years putting these principles into practice, but now he had the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. The thought of stepping into a classroom full of eager students, young people, who would one day be responsible for shaping the future of law enforcement, gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. He accepted the offer and began preparing for the course. On his first day at the university, Ryan felt a twinge of nervousness as he walked into the lecture hall. The students sat quietly, some of them looking excited, others curious, all waiting for the former police chief who had gained national recognition for his reforms. "Good afternoon," Ryan began, standing at the front of the class. "My name is Ryan Carter, and am here to talk to you about the future of policing." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "But before we talk about the future, we need to understand the past, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments when we didn't get it right. Because if we don't learn from those moments, we'll be doomed to repeat them." The room was silent as Ryan spoke, but he could feel the students' attention. Their interest piqued. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming." "Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.